Dans 20-25 jours, de manger ce qui nous reste de chat, de rats et tout, n'est plus le moindre repas après le vote.
We sometimes start a celebration like this with a toast, but given we're all on Zoom and everything, I thought we would start with a song. So this is called Our Fabulous Red Flag, written in 1885 by Achille Leroy. And it speaks of how the red flag was the workers' flag in the Revolution of 1848 and again in 1871. Now, Melbourne Comrades have got a brochure that we designed and put out. I'm not sure whether people have it interstate. So if you have that, it's got the words on it. So, and those of you who know French, you can sing along. Yeah. Angus is going to play that for us.
Arboré sur main beffroi, emblème éclatant du courage. Toujours il fit pâlir les rois. Le voilà, regardez, il flotte fièrement, il bouge. C'est l'oubli au combat préparé. Osez, osez le défier, notre superbe drapeau rouge, rouge du sang de l'ouvrier, rouge du sang de l'ouvrier. Mais planté sur les barricades par les héros de février, il devint pour les camarades le drapeau du peuple ouvrier. Le voilà, regardez, il flotte fièrement, il bouge, c'est l'oubli au combat préparé. Osez, osez le défier, notre superbe drapeau rouge, rouge du sang de l'ouvrier, rouge du sang de l'ouvrier. Sous la commune, il flotte encore, à la tête des bataillons, et chaque barricade arbore ses longs plis taillés en haillons. Le voilà, regardez, il flotte fièrement, il bouge, ses longs plis au combat préparé. Osez, osez le défier, notre superbe drapeau rouge, rouge du sang de l'ouvrier, rouge du sang de l'ouvrier, noble étendard du...
Okay, well, let's start with what Marx wrote about the Commune a few days after it was repressed. This was the first revolution in which the working class was openly acknowledged as the only class capable of social initiative, even by the great bulk of the Paris middle class, shopkeepers, tradesmen, merchants, the wealthy capitalists alone excepted. Now, Belleville, side by side with Montmartre, where it all began, is described by one historian as the most solidly working class district in all of Paris and the most revolutionary. Paris had been transformed, however, by Baron Haussmann in the service of the dictator Napoleon Bonaparte. New wide boulevards cut swathes through workers' districts, destroying their homes, and the poor had crowded into Montmartre and Belleville, where they could still get to their jobs in the centre and where they still frequented the cafes, mixing with radicals, students, journalists, writers, and artists. Now, a majority of the working class needed government assistance to survive, and these areas lived in the worst poverty and squalor, right beside the scenes of the wealthy's magnificent homes and elegant cafes, their sparkling, elegant stores, built all over the workers' demolished neighbourhoods. So while they weren't really radical particularly, they were a politicised population. So let's us step back into their time. On the 18th of March at dawn, sleepy workers start emerging from their homes, preparing to go to work. There's a slight fog drifting around the hill of Montmartre, and there's ice on the ground. But hang on, what are those soldiers doing? They're hanging around our cannon, and they're regarded as their cannon, financed by workers' subscriptions to the National Guard, a popular militia since 1848. And a London Times correspondent described Montmartre as rugged open spaces where the lawless crowds of these parts loved to hold their meetings and park their cannon, which you can see on the slide. And just 3 weeks ago, hundreds of workers had helped the National Guard move 250 cannon from military barracks into Montmartre and Belleville to defend them against bombardment by Bismarck's Prussian army. So just imagine the effort, determination it took for them to move them with no horses to drag them. Now, Bonaparte had gone to war last July for the glory of France, and now Adolphe Thiers, head of a new government elected in February, was hated as the butcher who repressed the 1848 revolution, and he had capitulated to, they never had any chance of winning the war in the first place, and he had moved his government and troops to Versailles, abandoning Paris to siege by Bismarck's army. And during the siege, workers had been reduced to eating cats and rats, dying of hunger and cold in their thousands. 60,000 people died in the siege, and the overwhelming majority were workers. And Thiers had now signed an armistice with Bismarck, which included an agreement that they would cooperate to crush Red Paris. And now Thiers' soldiers are there trying to remove their cannon. And sensing trouble, the soldiers knew that they needed to get the cannon out as quickly as possible before workers came out, and they were blocking the churches so they couldn't get in to ring the bells. But some workers, now wide awake, broke into the belfries. Now, fortuitously, General Pinoy, displaying the general incompetence of his class, forgot to organise horses to move the cannon. And what do people do when they're all standing around idly wondering what's going to happen next? They talk. And in this situation, this was a very democratic, subversive activity that horrified the officers. Women offering bread and wine, asking the underfed soldiers, "Why are you stealing our cannon?" And the crowd is swelling, transforming itself from sleepy spectators to increasingly angry and active participants. An observer described the unfolding events as horses did arrive. Women and children swarming up the hillside in a compact mass. The artillery tried in vain to fight their way through the crowd, but the waves of people engulfed everything, surging over the cannon mounts, over the ammunition wagons, under the wheels, under the horses' feet, paralysing the advance of the riders who spurred on their mounts in vain. And on the other side of Montmartre, apparently a general was pelted with vegetables, for causing him to fall off his horse and basically fade away. Now, Louise Michel, one of the most flamboyant of the radicals, would later recall of these moments. It was as if we were risen from the dead. Yes, Paris was rising from the dead. Crowds like this are sometimes the vanguard of the ocean of humanity. But it was not death that awaited us as they had expected. No, it was the surprise of a popular victory. General Lecomte 3 times orders the soldiers to fire on the crowd, and a woman challenges the soldiers. "Are you going to fire on us, on our brothers, on our husbands, on our children?" And Lecomte threatens to shoot any soldier who refuses to do just that. And as they hesitate, he asks, "Are you going to surrender to this scum?" And a non-commissioned officer steps out from the ranks and calls out, "Turn your guns around and put the rifle butts up in the air," and the soldiers obey. Now, Verdiger, that young officer, will later be shot for this action, but the revolution has begun. And the role of the women is remarked on by everyone. One officer reports of his experience. "We were stopped by a crowd of several hundred, principally children and women. The infantry detachment completely forgot their duty and dispersed into the crowd, succumbing to its perfidious seductions and ending by turning up their rifle butts. Okay, well, one historian comments, the instinctive response to trouble in Montmartre and Belleville was the barricade. And the Times correspondent, returning from similar scenes around Belleville, visits the barricade where he had witnessed the laying of the first stone. It had now, he says, grown to considerable dimensions. You can see it on the slide. Because everyone who passes by has to place a stone to add to this growing construction. And there's piles of stones on either side of the road to facilitate this, and they're being accumulated by children running around having a great time, presumably. Now, new barricades springing up in every direction, he writes. The whole affair wore a most strange and incomprehensible aspect to one not brought up to making barricades. And instead of a government blocking every street, as was the case in the morning, a hostile cannon was now looking down every street. So we've just witnessed how revolutions happen. The attempted seizure of the cannon had unleashed a well of bitterness fed by 2 decades of dictatorship, poverty, and the ravages of Bismarck's siege since September. And by midday, the Hotel de Ville, the Paris town hall, was seized by the National Guard. And just think of it, this is just one morning of rebellion. They now have the confidence to occupy this grand building at the heart of political power. So radical Paris confronts the government in Versailles. And the Commune will create the most democratic institutions known to humanity at that time. The Universal Commune, they called it, a radical social innovation. Now, unfortunately, the National Guard's committee had only been elected a few weeks before, and they lacked confidence. They didn't feel they had much authority, and they felt they had to have an election. And so they let the mostly conservative mayors from around Paris set the rules for the election, and they basically used the old rules from the right-wing government, and which, for one thing, excluded women from the vote. But their own democratic innovations were a historic step forward on anything before. All elected officials could be recalled at any time. There were no fixed terms. People didn't do as they pleased and continue. So someone like Andrew Laming would be out on his neck within days. And what's more, all kinds of civic officials like judges, magistrates, and top public servants were to be elected on the same basis, and they would all receive just a worker's wage. So the whole structure differed fundamentally from the most democratic capitalist state. Those elected would share the consequences of their decisions. They were not shielded by privileges and a great wealth. And even enemies of the Commune couldn't help but convey the joyous atmosphere typical of all revolutions. One of them recorded the experience standing in front of the Hotel de Ville while the names of those that had been elected to the Commune Committee were read out 10 days later. I write these lines still full of emotion. 100,000 perhaps. Where did they come from? From every corner of the city, armed men spilled out of every nearby street, and the sharp points of the bayonets glittering in the sun made the place seem like a field of lightning. The music playing was the Marseillaise, a song taken up in 50,000 resolute voices. This thunder shook all the people, and the great song, out of fashion from defeats, recovered for a moment its former energy. An immense sea of banners, bayonets, and caps surging. The cannon still thundered, but they were heard only in intervals between the singing. Then all the sounds merged into a single cheer, the universal voice of the countless multitude, and all these people had but one heart, just as they had one voice. So the state power has been demolished, and this for Marx was of momentous importance. He'd been arguing that this was what a revolution would have to do since 1848. And Paris, he wrote, the central seat of the old governmental power, and at the same time the social stronghold of the French working class, had risen in arms against Thiers. Paris had got rid of the army and replaced it by a National Guard, the bulk of which consisted of working men. This fact was now to be transformed into an institution. The first decree of the Commune, therefore, was the suppression of the standing army and the substitution for it of the armed people. And so the structures that they had created politically, he said, have become the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economical emancipation of labour. So now, after the experience of taking matters into their own hands and the exhilaration of defeating the generals, the population enthusiastically joins in debates and activities in dozens of radical clubs all around Paris. So let me introduce you to some of the key figures that a Marxist conference should identify with. The most radical, often with years of experience in workers' struggles and mostly close to Marx. Elisabeth Dmitriert. She was a Russian revolutionary who went to Paris at Marx's request. She'd spent months talking to Marx every week about politics, and she's still remembered in the middle of Paris. On April 11th, an appeal to the women citizens of Paris was posted on walls around the city and published in the newspapers of the Commune. People in Socialist Alternative would have fitted in well in the Commune. It was always posters everywhere. Can you hear the cannons roar and the tocsin sound its sacred call? To arms! Is it the foreigner who has come to invade France? No, these enemies, these assassins of the people and of liberty are the French. This combat to the death is the final act in the eternal antagonism between right and might, between work and exploitation, between the people and their tyrants. Citoyenne, the gauntlet has been thrown. It is necessary to vanquish or to die. We must prepare to defend and avenge our brothers. So this signified the launch by Elisabeth Dmitriert of the Union des Femmes, or the Women's Union. It became the largest and most effective organisation in the Commune, meeting daily in almost every one of the 20 arrondissements, which is basically like our suburbs. And the membership was dominated by workers in the garment trade, seamstresses, laundresses, dressmakers and the like. And the union's discussions included theoretical questions about ending private property, the issues of gender-based inequality. As well, they were solving the day-to-day struggle to provide food and fuel to families, and they participated in the defence of the Commune, maintenance of the barricades, and tending to the sick and wounded. In cooperation with the Commune Committee and its Labour Commission, they provided well-paid work making guardsmen's uniforms under women workers' control, and they were involved in all kinds of attempts to make work more under workers' control. Nathalie Lemel, also remembered in central Paris. She was a bookbinder, allied with Marx in the First International and worked closely with Dmitriert. Benoit Malon, he was also close to Marx. He helped set up an asylum for orphans where they could be offered basic instruction. Paul Mink opened one of the first schools for girls, and she requisitioned a Jesuit school because, reflecting the power and wealth of the church, it was endowed with the most advanced equipment and laboratories. So there's so many reforms, we can't really list all of them, but I want to mention some of the most significant and what was celebrated a lot at the time. Night work for bakers was abolished. Edouard Vaillant set up a professional school of industrial art for girls, which introduced a new approach to teaching. Any skilled worker over the age of 40 could apply to become a professor. And the whole commune was concentrated on establishing free education with no church interference for both boys and girls. Teachers' salaries were raised with equal pay for women and men. Secular nurseries were set up. And we get a glimpse of what the children might have been learning. A gentleman witnessed to his horror a band of 200 toddlers marching behind a drum and a small red flag. They sing at the top of their lungs, La Marseillaise, this grotesque parade celebrated the opening of a lay school organised by the Commune. The churches were taken over as meeting places for the clubs mainly, but also used for schools and other community activities. And Le Sageret, another member of the International, close to Marx and author of one of the first books published about the Commune, penned a colourful description of a club meeting beneath the soaring ceilings and the beautiful stained glass windows of one of the churches. The revolution mounts the pulpits. Almost hidden by the shadow of the vaults hangs the figure of Christ, draped in the popular oriflamme. And he deliberately must have chosen that term. It's not just a scarlet banner. In its literary meaning, it denotes a principle or an ideal that serves as a rallying point in a struggle. The only luminous centre is the reading desk, facing the pulpit hung with red. The organ and the people chant the Marseillaise. The orator, overexcited by these fantastic surroundings, launches forth into ecstatic declamations which the echo repeats like a menace. The people discuss the events of the day, the means of defence. The members of the Commune committee are severely censured, which they were subjected to all the time because they weren't very efficient, and vigorous resolutions are voted to be presented to the Hotel de Ville the next day. And just think about how occupying these odes to privilege and power must have been a constant reminder of the challenge that the Commune had thrown down before the bourgeoisie, the monarchy, and their ally, the church. And under the influence of these radicals and others like them, workers embraced reforms that were well ahead of their time, and many of them hardly achieved in much of the world today. Allowances for widows of men killed defending the Commune, whether officially murdered or not, and their children, whether legitimate or not, which was quite a big issue, in respect to the church. At the urging of some of the clubs, the Commune endorsed the right to abortion, and any businesses whose owners had fled to Versailles were taken over and put under workers' control. And there were all kinds of attempts to get work under workers' control and improve their conditions. And things like, there was a moratorium on debts and pawn shops weren't allowed to sell their goods and stuff. And significantly, even though they had suffered under Bismarck's siege, they were determinedly internationalist, inspiring support around Europe from workers, including thousands at demonstrations in London. So, for instance, the Jewish Hungarian worker, Leo Frankel, a collaborator of Marx, was Commissioner of Labour, and 2 Poles were given responsibility for organising defence. And most famously of all, they destroyed this imperialistic Vendôme column bearing Bonaparte's statue at the top. And skilled engineers and workers organised to pull it down without damaging the surrounding buildings. So it wasn't just some spontaneous thing that happened. It was well planned and thought out. And we can see the statue on the ground, I think, at the moment, and they reduced the whole thing to rubble. And the Place Vendôme was renamed Place Internationale. Now, Gustave Courbet, an artist who, well, famous today, he was persecuted for the rest of his life because he was accused of ordering the demolition, which has never been proved. And he established the Artists' Federation. Eugène Potier, author of the Internationale, the song, wrote its founding manifesto. And the Federation held debates about the role of the artists in society, the integration of art into everyday life, and how to overcome the counterposition between beauty and utility. As an example of their influence, if anyone knows the work of the socialist poet and fabric designer, William Morris, he was much influenced by their theories. And it attracted well-known artists such as Corot, Manet and Daumier, who scorned those who, like Cézanne, Pissarro and Degas, associated with the reactionaries in Versailles. So you can keep those names in mind next time you're at the National Gallery. Now, Napoleon Gaillard was a shoemaker, and he was appointed commissioner for the Barricades. And I mention him because he's sort of typical of what the Artists' Federation stood for. This is him posed on top of the main barricade he designed, to claim it as his artistic celebration. And he would later write theses about the art of designing shoes for the foot and all the rest of it. And this is him, I think, is he up? Dressed for the moment. And Marx commented on all of these incredible, creative actions and reforms. What does this tremendous change prove to the bourgeois mind of all countries? Why that the Commune has conspired against civilization. And the savagery unleashed by the capitalists at the end of May, known as La Semaine Sanglante, the bloody week, should be burnt into the consciousness of every anti-capitalist, and people who are into non-violence should take pause. Government troops massacred at least 30,000. About 38,000 were arrested and thrown into dungeons, and more than 7,000 deported. Thousands fled into exile. But I don't want to dwell on the horror. Instead, I'm going to play another song, which is mentioned on the pamphlet if you have it, and the photos with it to convey the suffering, but also its call to avenge the dead. And as you watch these images, we can start. As you watch the images, think of many similar images ever since in the history of capitalism. The destruction of Dresden by the Allies, a beautiful ancient city of no military importance, full of refugees, bombed to smithereens to demoralise the population, to prevent the possibility of revolution like after World War I. Think of the Vietnamese villages destroyed in order to save them, in the word of US generals, and what has happened in Syria against a peaceful democratic movement. And think of what is happening in Myanmar today in the struggle for democracy.
Ce gazon que le soleil dore, comme un sordeux doit réveiller, ce mur que qui saigne encore, c'est le tombeau des fusillés, c'est le tombeau des fusillés. L'odeur, la semaine sanglante s'achève, l'agneau se souvient du peuple, la justice est lente, elle est lente, mais elle vient. Le fils fera comme le père, la justice vous guette au seuil. Craignez de voir sortir de terre les morts enterrés sans cercueil. Oubliez les lions qu'on pousse, mordent quand ils sont réveillés. Fleurs rouges écloses dans la mousse, l'avenir pousse sur le tombeau des fusillés, sur le tombeau des fusillés.
And Nathalie Lamel, in the last days, took command of a contingent of the Union des Femmes, and they marched red flag in the lead to defend a barricade under fire, one that Elisabeth dubbed the legendary barricade. There, 120 women held back government troops for several hours. One of many who was shot was the dressmaker Blanche Lefebvre, an organiser of the Union des Femmes and a member of Marx's circle. Lamel cared for the wounded for hours. Her comrade Elisabeth Dmitriert was at Montmartre with Louise Michel and Leo Frankel in the last hours. And women, men and children chose to die bravely rather than surrender. Courage was their last revolutionary act. And the story that epitomizes the whole event is one that people tell again and again. A young boy asked for leave to take his silver watch to his mother before being shot so that she didn't lose everything. Now, the writer, Émile Zola, who hadn't supported the Commune, wrote a poem about this child, and in his version, the officer lets him go. And this sickly sentimentality serves no purpose but to cover up the crimes of the ruling class. Actually, this 10-year-old child returned to the barricade and was duly shot. Images of respectable women taking guided tours to gloat at the suffering of women thrown into filthy dungeons, holding their dainty handkerchiefs trimmed with the lace made by many of these women, and taking pleasure, particular pleasure, in poking the women with their parasols. These images are a warning. The respectable middle class, thought to be so cultured, revelled in the barbarity unleashed to restore them to their rightful privileged place. Much was made of the women of the Commune burning historic buildings, and they surely did, along with men and children, because fire was a weapon of defence. And Marx defended it, and so should we. He wrote, while tearing to pieces the living body of the proletariat, its rulers must no longer expect to return triumphantly into the intact architecture of their abodes. The government of Versailles cries incendiarism. The bourgeoisie of the whole world, which looks complacently upon the wholesale massacre, is convulsed by horror at the desecration of brick and mortar. Oh, sorry, I've got to know these people so well. And after the killing, the powerful and respectable set out to obliterate the memory of the kind of world that workers could build. The Vendôme column was rebuilt as a matter of priority. And on Montmartre, this monstrosity was built to eradicate the memory of the holy water, replaced with piles of tobacco, statues of the Virgin Mary, wearing the fighter's uniform, red flag in hand and a cigar in her mouth, watching over the debates about the need for secular education and for all and women's rights, including abortion. Reactionaries like Pissarro played their role. Saccharine representations of genteel street scenes reassured the middle classes that La Semaine Sanglante had secured Paris for their pleasure. But they could never erase the memory of the Commune completely. Members of the Artists' Federation created powerful images of ruling class barbarism as a warning for future generations. Courbet's Fédéré, his drawing of his cell in which children were incarcerated beside him. Manet's Guerre Civile. And the activists continued their rebellious natures to the end. Nathalie Lamel was still marching in the streets late in her life, captured in this shot. We've seen the squares named after her and Elisabeth Dmitriert right in the centre of Paris. On May Day 1901, thousands joined the funeral processions for Paul Mink through the streets of Paris, chanting "Vive la Commune, Vive Internationale," as more than 600 police, 500 soldiers and 100 cavalry guarded the streets against a repeat of 1871. The Commune surely was a sphinx that haunted the mind of the bourgeoisie, as Marx put it. More than 100,000 attended Louise Michel's funeral in Paris in 1905, honouring her ceaseless rebellion to the end. Socialists and anarchists celebrated the Commune for decades into the 20th century, and today it is generally remembered. They celebrate, and we do, its achievements, and remember with pride the courage of children, women and men who chose to die honourably rather than surrender. And their bravery stood as a symbol of resistance to the depravity of capitalism in places as remote as the New South Wales outback mining city of Broken Hill, here in our own country, which I discovered researching there. And this plaque, where many fell at the last, is still a mecca for leftists, where if you're in Paris, you go with your red roses and renew your commitment to the struggle. And the images of resistance against the ferocity of the capitalist state, while the form has changed, actually unites the struggles of the 21st century with Paris of 1871. I think you can see the Hong Kong students and their barricades of 2019. So the points I want to leave you with are this. Revolutions are inevitable in this inhumane, crisis-ridden system. And the Commune showed that it is possible to destroy the capitalist state and to replace it with the thoroughly democratic structures that only workers' struggles can create. Only revolutionary struggles led by the working class give rise to such creativity, collectivity, and radical reforms that we witnessed in the Commune. And it is such struggle which can make workers fit to found society anew, as Marx and Engels wrote in one of their first works as young men. And belief in this possibility of self-emancipation, I would argue, is at the heart and soul of Marxism. Academics who call themselves Marxists and they think it's just an economic theory know nothing about the heart of Marxism. And so I'm going to finish with the words of the long-term socialist feminist writer and editor of the magazine La Sociale, known in the Commune as André Leo, I think it is, which sum up this point her words sum it up quite beautifully. The soldier of the present revolution is of the people. Just yesterday, he was in his little shop, his chest bent down to his knees, plying his awl or his needle or hammering iron. How many people passed by without knowing, without believing that a man was there?